Welcome back, AP. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right back into Russia with this really ugly Google Slides that I have to use because I still haven't had time to update my Prezi and everything with what was going on over the weekend and stuff. But let's go ahead and jump into it and kind of just bang out the rest of Russia real fast. So where we left off in class, we were talking about this particular church, right, the Savior of the Spilled Blood, which is where Alexander II will be assassinated, right? Now, Alexander II is the guy who freed the serfs, made the Zemstvo, abolished capital punishment, encouraged industrialization, rolled out some railroads, tried to create a factory model, right? Like, very progressive politician. But the guy that's going to replace him is going to be Alexander III of Russia. And Alexander III of Russia is a reactionary. He's not nearly as good. He doesn't have any plans to keep industrializing anything until a guy like this comes along, right? And this dude is Sergey Vitter, right? So Sergey Vitter is a very important key leader in the Russian industrialization process, right? And he's going to come to power in about, give or take, 1890 is where his political career truly begins. But at about 1894, he becomes the chief finance minister of Russia. And he actually comes in underneath, I believe, Tsar Nicholas II, but we're going to talk about him in here in a second. Whereas Tsar Nicholas II was an idiot, Sergey Vitter is the man, right? So Sergey Vitter believed that industrial backwardsness will crush any potential Russian power. And he wasn't wrong. Sergey Vitter is actually very, very smart in this approach because he is realizing more and more that if we do not industrialize properly, then Russia will literally take a backseat to the rest of the European powers, right? And he's 100% right. You've got Prussia becoming Germany and France under Napoleon III becoming powerful. And then you've also got Austria doing Austrian things. They're not doing nearly as much as everybody else. But then you've also got Italy becoming an industrial power in the north. You've got Spain over there being Spain still. And Great Britain, of course, leading the way in industrial progressiveness. So big thing Sergey Vitter is going to do the second he gets into office as the chief finance minister is he's going to double the network of railways and he's going to make them nationalized or state-owned, right? Now, this is a really big deal. This is very, very different from the creation of railways in the continent. See, Sergey Vitter is smart enough to come along and realize that we cannot keep doing the same thing that everyone else did 200 years behind schedule. Not 200 years, but over 100 years behind schedule. So he actually creates a network of state-owned railways that will create commerce for the government in taxable forms and be able to be then used for the people later on. He also sets high tariffs on any foreign-made goods that are made outside of Russia. Now, tariffs are very important because they decrease the amount of expenditures and the amount of products purchased from overseas, right? So the Russians are going to create Russian-made goods and encourage Russian people to purchase them, right? Sergey, very nice job. He also creates a gold standard economy to try and help prevent inflation, where every single Russian ruble, which is what they're called, every ruble would be backed up by that net worth of rubles, gold, in their economy. And this would help prevent inflation by preventing the unauthorized production of monetary funds, right? And then last but not least, he also creates the outsourcing model in Russia. Now, what do I mean by that? So whenever we were looking at Alexander II, he was freeing the serfs and he was bucking back against the former boyars and the aristocracy of Russia, you have to understand those people would have been the ones that would have created factories, created these larger things. Russia was devoid of a large merchant class that would invest in the factory model. So what he does is he encourages foreign countries to build their factories inside of Russia to employ Russian workers and create Russian-made goods, right? And this would create a new network of funds, and they would be able to charge what was very, very expensive money in Russia, but not as expensive in like French money, to set that factory up in Russia because Russia was still so much mostly peasants, right? 90% of Russia was agrarian before Alexander II begins his great reforms. So this would provide work and wages for Russian people and also would stimulate the Russian economy. Good job, Sergey. Problem is, though, he's working under this idiot, right? So this dude is an absolute not very bright individual. This guy is Tsar Nicholas II, right? Tsar Nicholas II is going to be crowned and I believe 1894, but let me check my date on that. Yep, 1894. In 1894, Tsar Nicholas II will be crowned Tsar of Russia, right? And from the very first day, Tsar Nicholas II's reign proved to be terrible, right? And a lot of it started at his coronation ceremony, also known as the Kadinka tragedy, right? So the Kadinka tragedy was the event at his actual inauguration. So the Russian poor that were filtering into Moscow, that were showing up, were encouraged to come watch his inauguration, right? And they all assembled inside of this place called the Kadinka Field inside of Moscow, right? Which would have been outside of one of the larger palaces where he was actually being coronated, right? And when the rumors began to spread about the Kadinka tragedy, the interesting thing that happens is people start saying, oh man, they're going to have free beer there. They're going to have free pretzels, free bread. And I heard they're even giving out cups that have like a little gold coin on the bottom of them that you can use as money in our new gold standard economy. So big thing is Nicholas II did nothing to stop these rumors. And so you had thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people show up in the Kadinka Field to see Nicholas II be inaugurated, right? But what happened is when rumors then began to spread that bread was no longer available, it wasn't available in the first place, that the cups were no longer available, they weren't available in the first place, that the pretzels were no longer available, they wasn't available in the first place, and that the beer had run out, people start getting hasty. And then the military was brought in to try and make sure that the crowd didn't freak out. Well, the poor Russians freaked out anyway, and they began to run out of the Kadinka Field as fast as they possibly could, and they trampled over 20 different people to death, right? So the day that Tsar Nicholas II becomes the Russian Tsar, literally people got trampled to death, right? Just to give you an understanding of how just fraught with terrible ruling this guy's rule is going to be. And within 11 years, the year 1905 rolls around. And by 1905, things in Russia start to get very, very shaky. All of the progress that was brought in by Sergey Vitter, all of the ideas, all of the outsourcing and the factory model and the factory class growing and all these good things start kind of blowing up in Tsar Nicholas II's face. Now, this is ironically enough also during a break in Sergey Vitter's political career, but he does come back and he becomes the prime minister of Russia inside of a legislative body that I'll show you here in a second. Now, a lot of this, though, is due to the fact that imperialism is going to reach its height around 1903. So you have to understand imperialism is going to be another thematic thing that we are going to discuss when we get done with nationalism and socialism. Imperialism is also considered to be a direct cause of World War I. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that every single European country was involved in this new imperial trend of going out, taking over an undeveloped country, using social Darwinism to advocate for your strength, and then abusing that country's people and their resources for monetary gain, right? A good example is the Belgian conquest of the Congo. Another good example is the British conquest of Southern Africa. Another good example is the British conquest of India. Another good example is the British conquest of Australia. Another good example is the British conquest of Falkland Islands. Another good example is the British conquest of everyone, all right? So now the big thing about it, though, is that it's peaking out around 1903, and this little brat decides that he wants to become involved late in the game, right? Because Russia does not have many imperial territories outside of maybe the Ukraine, which is attached to their country at this time, Belarus, which is also attached, Latvia, Estonians, things like that, right? Finland also. But again, these are all landlocked areas that they own. The Russians, on the other hand, decide that they want to eye up Chinese Manchuria, and they want to basically extend the eastern reaches of their border. Now, to give you a heads up, let me show you where Manchuria is. Where Manchuria is DMAP's world map. Okay, so now that I have my world map up, that took a couple of seconds to get up, the thing you got to understand is Russia is a gigantic country, right? And as we know, the Europeans, like I just mentioned, are going to be imperializing pretty much all of Africa, Southeast Asia, areas in South America. Russia decides that they want to industrialize and imperialize a place called Chinese Manchuria, which is up here, right? So they want to go to the east, and they want to take over this area. And in that area, they want to set up different factory models. They want to set up different trade routes and influence there. Now, they have to contend with some people, including, most of it, importantly, the Japanese, right? Because the Japanese also decide that they want to imperialize that same area known as Chinese Manchuria, right? So since they want to go there, they want to create that new pipeline of goods and raw materials that exists inside of Chinese Manchuria because they believe that they are not to be as developed as the Russian Empire at this point. And they weren't completely wrong. Chinese Manchuria was full of raw materials, but was kind of out of the reach of the Qing dynasty that was actually, I believe, in rule during this time period. Now, Japan also wants this as well. And then also, a lot of this has to do with the fact that everybody was fighting over China during this time period because the British had come in the late 1800s and taken over during a series of these things called the Opium Wars. And we'll talk about that again a little bit later. But the big thing, though, is Japan wants Chinese Manchuria as well. And that led to this thing known as the Russo-Japanese War, right? Now, something you need to understand is that Russia believed that they were going to smoke Japan in this war. They believed that they were going to just destroy them because it had not been until about 50 years before that Japanese culture was still reigning supreme within their borders and that their military was still mostly members of a class known as samurai, right? So they were using swords and bows and arrows no more than 100 years before this, right? So the Russians believed that they were going to show up and absolutely wreck house inside of Japan and take over Chinese Manchuria. And Nicholas also believed that this would be a moment to encourage Russian nationalism and grow pride for the Russian people by beating up on a weaker power, right? But what ended up happening is it blew up in his face because Russia suffered another humiliating defeat at the hands of a barely just 5 minutes ago industrialized Japan. Because Japan industrialized during this thing known as the Meiji Restoration, when they actually called upon European powers to come in and show up and actually industrialize their entire area, their army, their military, create an infrastructure of telegraphs and roadways and electrical wiring and things like that. And so Japan was barely industrialized. They had just started doing this, and they smoked the Russian military. And I was slapped down in the bottom a little description or a little video of the Russo-Japanese War by 10 Minute History. It's absolutely phenomenal. But what is this going to cause back home in Russia? It's going to cause massive unrest and massive uproar, right? Because Russian workers are going to organize an illegal labor party. That's right. Russia still had laws that prevented the organization of workers into labor unions, right? And so Russian workers are going to mobilize regardless, and they're going to be vying and demanding a democratic liberal government like the rest of Europe has. They want a constitution. They want a parliament. They want all these things. And since the army is occupied in Japan, the poor are with the support of other minority nationalities that exist within Russia, the Ukrainians, some of the Slovakians, some of the Crimeans, some of the Belarusians, and like other groups like that, and even some of the Jewish minorities begin to nationalize and begin to mobilize in 1905 and create mass demonstrations out front of places like the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, right? And this is going to lead to an insane event where a lot of protesters showed up outside of the Winter Palace in Russia, right? And it actually looked like this, right? So, Bloody Sunday, Russia. There are two Bloody Sundays in European history. One of them is in Russia, and the other one is inside of Ireland, right? Do not get the two things confused. But what ended up occurring on the Bloody Sunday is a massive group of people arrived to demonstrate and publicly denounce the rule of Tsar Nicholas II out front of his Winter Palace home, right? They show up, they're demanding bread, they're demanding constitutions, they're demanding a liberal government that is voted on and executed by the people. And also, another big thing is, there are a huge coalition of priests leading this entire thing, demanding that the Russian people be kept safe and out of harm's way. Well, What ended up happening is Tsar Nicholas II could care less that there are priests in the crowd, and the thing you have to understand is what's going to end up happening in January of 1905 on a Sunday afternoon. A massive crowd is going to show up out front of St. Petersburg, in front of the Winter Palace, to present a petition, and what do you think Nicholas does? Out of fear and out of contempt for the poor, he demands the military open fire on them. And the military, you guessed it, killed and wounded hundreds of people. Innocent, peaceful protesters. There was not a gun in the crowd. Priests were slain. Women were slain. Children were slain during Bloody Sunday. And the major effect of this is going to be there is now an extreme amount of contempt as of 1905. This is also considered a failed revolution. Jot that down. Put the failed revolution of 1905. An extreme amount of contempt for the Tsar and the monarchy by the working class, right? And this is going to trigger multiple uprisings by workers and troop mutinies in the military. And then this failed revolution of 1905 is going to have some idea of a success. And what they decide to do is instead of showing up in fields like on Bloody Sunday and getting shot at by the military, they decide to just close the doors of every single Russian shop. I don't think you understand the effect that a national strike can incur, right? But literally, every worker in Russia during October of 1905 was just like, you know what? I ain't working anymore. And they all refused. Factories ground to a halt. Railroads ground to a halt. Shops, bakeries, basic necessities ground to a halt because all the Russian workers were like, we will not work until you give us our demands. And so what's going to happen is the Tsar, Nicholas II, is going to issue this thing called the October Manifesto. And in that, this is going to establish full civil rights for Russian people, right? And it's going to appoint this thing called the Duma, right? And the Duma is going to be the new legislative body inside of this constitution. Now, the election of the Duma is going to split the opposition, though, right? Because the middle class is going to suppress lower class rebellions, feeling they had won, right? So in 1905, the growing middle class of Russia, following the Sergey Vitter second wave of industrialization and their growing wealth and things like that, and their resurgence into the bourgeois, right? They're going to tell the lower class workers, stop rioting, stop freaking out. We got what we wanted. We got a constitution that gives us rights and is going to give us these different things. We have won. We have done what we needed to do, right? The monarchy, though, is going to stay alive by creating a constitutional monarchy. And on the eve of the very first Duma organization in 1906, Tsar Nicholas II is going to issue the fundamental laws, or this new constitution. The Duma would be elected by universal male suffrage. It could create and debate laws. All they wanted, but the Tsar still retained an absolute veto, which is the stupidest premise I've ever heard of, because basically this Duma is ineffective, right? So when the middle class liberals begin to buck back, saying that they will tell the lower class to strike again, that they will tell them to go on riots, that they will tell them to go, to generally assemble and demand bread and freak out and start burning stuff to the ground, what Nicholas II does is he just liquidates the Duma. He dismisses them. He's like, okay, fine, you just don't meet anymore, right? And he rewrote the electoral process so that the majority of all the seats had to be held by Russians with aristocratic backgrounds, with upper class backgrounds, with conservative backgrounds. He abolished the idea of community-owned property, basically pushing against any growing socialist movement going on, and he pushed a Western factory model. And you have to understand that the Russian people are absolutely going to begin to despise their government, right? So, because not only did you just give them a constitutional monarchy and then a liberally voted upon universal male suffrage legislative body, but then you just took it away from them. And you were just like, here you go, psych, and then you just took it away, right? So, this unrest is now ridiculously high. And then they had to re-vote on the Duma based only on aristocratic values, and the majority of the seats had to be held by aristocrats who would directly support the Tsar, right? So this is insane. And this is just kind of emblematic of the state of a lot of these states in 1871 leading up to 1914. So you have to understand is that we are now going to be discussing the domestic policy in the political states of places from 1871 to about 1914, okay? And so basically we're talking about lead up to World War I, the internal states of all of these other places, right? How it affected the oncoming war. Most of these countries have the exact same framework, right? Common themes are you have parliaments, even in Russia, on the rise, coming up, like they showed up late, but just like everywhere else, you had the Reichstag in Germany. You had the Constitutional Constituent Assembly inside of France. You had the Parliament inside of Great Britain. You had a legislative body inside of Italy as well. So every single strong country, except for pretty much Austria, had a parliament that was on the rise, right? And also they had mass loyalty because universal male suffrage is on the rise, and women's suffrage movements are beginning to also take fire and move forward as well. And the big thing you got to ask yourself is, what are all these governments hiding? And this perfect service, this icy service where it looks like everything's getting better, what are they hiding? They're hiding underlying class conflicts, as we just discussed in Russia, middle class liberals, and then also upper class conservatives and lower class socialists all can't stand each other because they can't get on the same page. And militarism is going to be used to hide these things, right? Grow the military, draft some people into it, we'll be able to use it to hide these conflicts. And then also something you got to understand is there's a huge amount of animosity towards the minorities of Europe, right? So we're going to key off on those two things tomorrow in class. I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good